If you guys want to talk about jiu-jitsu, that's more fun to talk about. Arm drag versus berimbolo.
Yeah.
Go. Hi, I'm Dr. James Brown from Core Chiropractic in Flower Mound, Texas. I'm here with Ryan Young from Kama Jiu-Jitsu. I've been training jiu-jitsu for about 23 years. I got my black belt from Carlos Machado, 2004. I treat most of the jiu-jitsu guys that have been training for a long time around the DFW area, so I see a lot of injuries that are related to jiu-jitsu, and we can talk about a lot of commonalities that we're going to see between those injuries, and that most of you guys are going to have to get treated at one point or another, and how chiropractic can help you. So guys that are grappling, doing jiu-jitsu, a lot of the common injuries we see are injuries to the neck, or cervical spine. We see a lot of low back injuries. We see a lot of shoulder injuries, elbow injuries from different joint manipulations. We'll see foot and ankle injuries as well. If it's musculoskeletal, it can happen in jiu-jitsu, and most of you guys probably have or will have one of those injuries. The most debilitating injuries I've seen usually come from the spinal injuries. So if we see, for instance, a neck injury or cervical spine injury, a lot of times those can start off as annoying things, stiff neck, difficulty with your range of motion or turning your head. And if you don't treat those injuries, a lot of times what they do is they start to get worse and worse until you have a lot of joint inflammation in your neck. And then you can start to see some associated nerve inflammation, and we'll experience those as stingers. Sometimes my patients will come in and they've been thrown or they've hurt their neck, and then they'll start to have a stinging sensation down their arm. They may have numbness and tingling down their arm. They may actually have some muscle weakness. They should come see me right away if they're starting to have neck pain, back pain, shoulder pain, anything that's a musculoskeletal injury. Generally, the faster that we can treat an injury, the faster they're going to recover. If you let a joint stay inflamed, it's going to be a lot more difficult to resolve that inflammation after it's been chronic. So inflammation, that's a good question. I like that. What is inflammation? Inflammation is your body's own immune response to any outside pathogen or injury. So the inflammatory response is your body trying to fix itself. But what we know is the body doesn't repair joints, muscles, soft tissue very well. What you get with inflammation is an influx of scar tissue that tries to repair the injury, but if that injury happens to be a joint injury, what you end up is a joint that has a lot of scar tissue in it that can make that joint immobile. And another thing that inflammation will do is it will actually try to add more bone into the joint to make that joint more stable. So the scar tissue and the bone together helps to stabilize the joint, but it starts to limit the range of motion, right? So through chiropractic and physical medicine, you can mobilize the joint and keep that scar tissue from really stealing a lot of your range of motion. If you can return the function to the joint, what you get is a reduction in inflammation. So if you've got a joint that's very inflamed and you make that joint perform better, you make it move through its normal range of motion, then you're going to be able to reduce the inflammation. And associated musculature, you want to make sure that you have good function there as well. That's why we do physical medicine here. That's why we do specific rehabilitative exercise along with joint mobilization. Making that joint function better is going to reduce inflammation. And one of the things I tell my patients, maybe the most important thing I tell my patients is, if you can reduce inflammation in the joint, you're going to slow the rate of change in that joint, because inflammation causes osteoarthritis. Osteoarthritis is caused by chronic inflammation in a joint. So the longer a joint stays inflamed, whether the joint's in your neck, your shoulder, your knee, the longer you have a chronic inflammation, even at a low level, that joint changes. And then you start to develop osteoarthritis. And then we can rate that osteoarthritis mild, moderate, or severe. So the best thing to do is to treat the injury initially so that you don't start to develop chronic inflammation and then start to develop osteoarthritis in that particular joint. The worst situation with your students that I've seen is inflammation or injury to the neck and upper back causing numbness and tingling down the arm, left arm in this case. That injury is actually very common in jiu-jitsu. I've seen it quite a bit. It wasn't the worst injury I've ever seen related to jiu-jitsu, but it stands out because when this inflammation had been there a long time, and when a joint, as we mentioned before, becomes inflamed for a long time, and here's a little model, we'll use this. The proximity of the joint in the neck, which is by far the biggest complaint that I see, is joint inflammation. And a joint is defined as when two bones come together, they make a joint. In this case, it's where two vertebral bones come together, and there are 4 joints, 1, 2, 3, 4, at every vertebral level. There are 7 bones in the neck, so there's a lot of joints there. Between each vertebrae, you're going to see a disc, okay? That disc acts as a spacer, right? To give you a little spacer between those 2 vertebrae, and that's important because between those 2 vertebrae at every level, a little nerve comes out. These little nerves in the cervical spine go to your arms. So if you get a lot of inflammation in the joints in your neck, what you'll start to see and feel and experience a lot of times is nerve irritation, right? Because of the proximity. They're right there. The joint's there, the nerve is there. So this soft tissue gets inflamed because inflammation doesn't discriminate, it just inflames everything. You get soft tissue, which is the fascia. You'll get the joint that's very inflamed, and then the nerve itself will become inflamed. And then you'll start to see a pattern of sometimes numbness, sometimes tingling, sometimes just pain down the arm because each one of these little nerves go to a specific spot. So let's say left side of your neck, right? Some guys get you in a guillotine, he cranks your neck, and then you get left-sided joint inflammation, and that gets a little chronic over 3 or 4 weeks. I bet a lot of you guys have experienced that. That joint inflammation can start to make that nerve inflamed, and then every now and then you feel like a little zzz down your arm. And that little every now and then, if it's allowed to continue, can become a constant numbness and tingling. And we know that spinal nerves do 2 things. You get the brain to arm and the arm to brain pathway, right? So if you're getting numbness, that means from the arm to the brain, you're getting an interruption to the signal. From the brain to the arm and from the arm back to the brain can be affected because these things do 2 things. They carry sensory and motor. Sensory is what you feel, motor is what you do. So if you start to feel sensory, right, which is what everyone usually feels first, you might feel numbness, you might feel tingling, it's kind of weird, hard to put your finger on, but you're feeling something in your arm. You can also be sure that sooner or later, the motor pathway, which is brain to arm, is going to be affected as well. And that means muscle weakness and atrophy. Atrophy is when the muscle gets smaller, right? You see your arm go like that. And muscle weakness, obviously, is when you start to lose strength. I've experienced both of those, thank you, Jiu-Jitsu. As you have neck injury after decades of training Jiu-Jitsu, you're going to start to develop some osteoarthritis. We mentioned that before because arthritis is caused by chronic inflammation. When I was younger, I never got my neck treated. Of course, then I ended up going to chiropractic school and being surrounded by a bunch of awesome people that treat these injuries all the time. I started getting therapy, which slowed down the rate of degeneration in the spine, but it's still there because once you get arthritis, it doesn't go away. That's why it's important to slow the rate of change. That's why it's important to get treated soon after you get injured. So, back to our nerves. So, if you get a lot of inflammation in your neck from that guillotine choke, and that puts a chronic inflammation there, you might start to feel some irritation, some numbness and tingling in the arm, and that's because this nerve gets inflamed. That's why people have surgery, because they start to have neurological disorders that are due to chronic inflammatory conditions in the spine. Osteoarthritis in the spine. We mentioned bone inflammation, joint inflammation, cartilage inflammation in the joint. When you get a lot of inflammation in the joint over a long period of time, it actually changes these joints. They start to grow. You might notice your knuckles get bigger over time if they've been inflamed for a long time. In older people, you'll see gnarly knuckles, like you see some jiu-jitsu guys that make a lot of grips and they'll have gnarly knuckles because those knuckles have started to change from being chronically inflamed from making grips. Well, guess what? The same thing happens in your neck. You can get some gnarly big joints. And if you look, hard to see here, but easier to see in this little part, the joints here, if this joint starts to get bigger, it actually grows into the space that the nerve lives in, thereby closing that little hole down. By the way, that's called stenosis. When that little hole gets closed down, the nerve has less space to travel through. So if you get some inflammation, say you're doing great, you had some inflammation in your back, it went away, then you went and trained really hard 5 days in a row, and then you notice that you're sore, right? Because you have some inflammation there again. You already have some arthritis in that joint, but this time, the space that the nerve is traveling through is smaller. So this time when you have the inflammation in that joint, it actually inflames the nerve. And now you start to get, if it's in the lumbar spine, right, because we have those injuries too, it's the same thing. Cervical's up here, this is the neck, lumbar's down here, that's the low back. So if you go and re-aggravate a joint that's been chronically inflamed and injured that has arthritis, now your chances of nerve inflammation are much higher because the spaces are smaller, the joints have changed, the fascia, which is actually the connective tissue that binds things together, the soft tissue in the neck has some scarring, has some scar tissue. So this gets re-inflamed and then you get nerve irritation, right? And to relieve that, guess what you have to do? You have to go in with your roto-rooter and cut that bone and tissue out so that the nerve has a pathway to travel through again, and it relieves pressure mechanically around that nerve, which is what we're trying to avoid in the first place. If the joints are the problems, and the joint is what moves when you go and adjust or manipulate the neck or the low back or the shoulder, what we're doing is we're mechanically moving those joints, freeing those joints from restriction, making them function better. And what we know about a joint is if the joint is functioning well, right, it doesn't have cartilage tears, it doesn't have ligament or some sort of like injury that needs to be surgically repaired, because that does happen. If the joint is together, right, the joint has structural integrity, even if it has arthritis in it, which most of us have arthritis in our joints, if we make that joint function better, then inflammation will go down. And the whole idea is reduce inflammation. Inflammation is that body's immune response. Inflammation is what causes pain. So if we can increase the function of a joint, if we can make a shoulder move through its normal range of motion, if we can increase the strength of the rotator cuff and all the posterior chain of supporting elements for just the shoulder, then the shoulder is going to feel better. Even if it has osteoarthritis, we're going to make that shoulder feel better. If you have inflammation in your neck, and that's due to some osteoarthritis or maybe just an acute jiu-jitsu injury where you got your neck cranked, if you can increase the function, if you can increase the range of motion, if you can't turn left, and we go and we make your neck turn to the left, that's going to return function to those joints, and it's going to make them feel better. When those joints feel better, you know that you have a reduction in inflammation, and that sets you on to a healing process. So do we see certain injuries in different age groups? Yes and no. The injuries are the same, but age and experience complicate things. So if you start jiu-jitsu and you're 18 years old and you go and get your neck cranked on, or you go and get stacked in the guard and that puts a lot of pressure on your low back and the joints in your low back become very inflamed and you have low back pain, that patient, which is probably going to be more free of arthritis because they've only been alive for 18 years, arthritis takes a while to form and develop, that patient is going to respond faster to therapy than, say, a patient in his 30s. And that patient in his 30s, generally speaking, because we all have different experience levels and we've all done different stuff, but generally someone in his 30s is probably going to have less arthritis than someone in his 40s. So every year that you're alive, basically, you develop more and more little injuries, you're going to have more arthritis. So younger people tend to respond faster. People that are in shape tend to respond faster. That's why jiu-jitsu guys usually respond very well, because generally they tend to be in very good shape. People that are older, you might see them respond a little bit slower, but it's generally the same injury. If it weren't for joint inflammation, I wouldn't exist. We treat joint inflammation. But some people, but Dr. JB, don't you see some like acute muscle tears? Sometimes, but muscle tears, like if you tear your quadriceps, if you tear your biceps, if you tear your pec. Those are like big ones that we see. Generally, we're going to see those in a bit of an older population. As we get older, our tissue is not as elastic. It's not as stretchy. So if you put a lot of force through a pec, and we know old man strength, you get a little stronger as you get older. If you put more force through that muscle, you make it contract harder. Then sometimes that muscle tissue, because it's not as stretchy, will actually tear, right? We lose tensile strength or that ability to stretch. So yes, we will see muscle strain, sprain. A strain, sprain is defined. A sprain is defined as when you tear ligaments in a joint. A strain is when you tear muscle or tendon. So yes, we do see those, but the far greater majority of the injuries that I see are not muscular. They have a muscular component because muscles are the first protector of the joint. So if you have a lot of joint inflammation, you're going to see a muscular component. You're going to see sometimes muscles that are spasmy, muscles that are tight, muscles that have a lot of pain because they're involved in that injury because they respond to what happens to a joint. When a joint becomes very inflamed, the muscle will like tighten, shorten. We call that hypertonicity, right? When a muscle is tighter than it should be, and that muscle is hypertonic or tighter than it should be because it's helping to protect the joint, splint the joint. But if a muscle is tighter than it should be for a long period of time, it gets tired. It becomes painful. And then you get trigger points, and we see that quite a bit through the back. We call that a trigger point when a muscle's been tired and short for a long period of time. So like a spasm is when you get a right? And we see that a lot of times with guys with very acute low back pain. Guess what? I don't see that as much with jiu-jitsu guys because jiu-jitsu guys tend to be in really good shape.
Because they're strong abs.
Right. They have a strong core because it takes so much core to do jiu-jitsu. You see muscle spasms, like true muscle spasms, with a guy that finished playing football in 1981, sat down on the couch, and never got back up again. And it's 2018. One day he gets some inflammation in a joint, he starts to get up out of his couch, and then wham, he gets a lot of muscle spasm because now the muscle's really trying to support that joint. But guess what? That muscle is not in shape. It cannot support that joint. So now you get a lot of muscle spasm and pain, and he may not get up off the couch. I don't see that as much with jiu-jitsu guys. I see chronic, annoying joint inflammation, tight, sore muscles, and they're in such good shape, they can continue to function, they can continue to go train. But remember, chronic inflammation in a joint changes the joint. So what they get is a joint that's constantly getting more and more arthritis, getting bigger and gnarlier, and that's affecting what's going on in that spine. So how often should someone get adjusted if they're training moderately, or even if they're training like a lot, they're training 6 days a week? I get adjusted every week, but I can't because I have friends that do chiropractic. I can just pop over and get adjusted. If I miss my weekly adjustment, I feel it. For someone that is trying to maintain their health, that's feeling pretty good, I would say minimally once, if you're training 2 or 3 times a week, minimally once every 4 weeks or so, come, get treated, check mobility in the neck, check mobility in the shoulders, check mobility in the low back. So minimally once every 4 weeks. If you can do it every 2 weeks is fantastic. If you can do it every week, that's even better because now you're just functioning at a high level. That's what chiropractic allows us to do. It allows us to keep everything moving the way it should. It allows us to keep joints mobile, muscles stretchier so that you can perform at your maximum. So how can you get adjusted one day and then the next day you're sore with the same pain? Well, a lot of times we'll see if we take an NSAID. You take 800 milligrams of ibuprofen and you take that on Tuesday after you train jiu-jitsu. So you finish training, it's like 8 o'clock. You take a bunch of ibuprofen because you're sore, and then about 45 minutes later you feel pretty good. You can move. A lot of that inflammation is gone because you're getting a reduction in the inflammatory response to that joint, right? Your neck is sore, you take the Advil, now you feel better about 45 minutes later. After that Advil stops working 6 to 8 hours later, that joint pain comes back. Maybe not as severe. Maybe it actually feels better than it did before when it was really severe, but you're starting to get inflammation again, right? Chiropractic works a little bit like that. You go and mobilize the joint, a joint that's been fixated. You do a quick stretch on the muscles with that adjustment, that manipulation. You move that joint, which really needs to move to feel good, because joints move. That's how they feel good. Muscles change length. That's how they feel good. If they're stuck, short, tight muscles and a joint that's not moving, you go and quick stretch that joint, and man, it feels really good, right? That joint feels like it's moving again. You've restored some motion. But then you go down and you sleep for 6 to 8 hours and you stay stationary, and you're not moving as much as you would if you were up and awake, and the inflammation creeps back in, the joint starts to get stiff again. Maybe not as bad as it was. Maybe you get like 25-30% reduction in symptoms, but you need to go back and do that adjustment, that manipulation again, to make that joint feel better again. And not only that, I mean, I really love being adjusted, but you also have to do stretching. You also have to do joint mobilization on your own. You have to like improve the range of motion through stretching with bands, through doing mobility drills, through doing static stretching. You should be doing core exercises that engage the posterior chain. And what that does is, by making and engaging certain muscles in your spine, it helps to stabilize that joint and keep that joint feeling better, because it's returning function to the spine, right? Muscles that you might not engage by just doing jiu-jitsu. You might need to do some, and you do need to do some extra things to make yourself feel better. Why would you need to do chiropractic and do some physical therapy or specific rehabilitative exercise for whatever injury that you have? I think it's very important to do both. That's why I offer both. That's why I have exercise physiologists that work with my patients and do our protocols for specific injuries to specific joints, because I think that mobilizing the joint is important. Manipulating the joint is important. It helps to break up scar tissue. It helps to return a range of motion to that joint, which is a component of function. But you also have to do specific exercises with that joint to return the range of motion and to engage the right muscles that support that joint, so that you can increase the stability of the joint. And by increasing the stability of the joint through muscular reinforcement and increasing the mobility of the joint through manipulation and adjustments, then you're going to return that joint to its proper function, and you'll get a reduction in inflammation, a reduction in swelling, pain, discomfort. If you don't feel well, a lot of times, along with, if you have an infection, if you have a viral infection, if you have a bacterial infection, depending on what it is, if you're not feeling well due to an infection, you're going to be experiencing joint pain as well. Everyone's had the flu knows that their back hurts when they have the flu. Their neck might hurt when they have the flu. They may have body aches when they have the flu. So going and getting adjusted, because you have like globally, your body's globally inflamed, going and getting adjusted is going to make you feel better. It's going to make you function better. And when you feel better and function better, you get well faster. So I hope everybody got something out of that. If you guys want more information or you want to contact me, you can call 972-899-2258, or you can go to my website at corechiropractic.org.